Customers always want to hear about more ways to save money on their Microsoft contracts, and we've got a good suggestion today: Azure Reservations. Azure Reservations allow customers to reduce their Azure costs in exchange for 1 or 3-year purchase commitments. But of course, there are some loopholes that you need to know before you can take full advantage of these reservations. Welcome to the Directions on Microsoft Briefing podcast. I am Mary Jo Foley, the editor-in-chief here at Directions, and I'm your host for the series of podcasts for those interested in the Microsoft Enterprise IT ecosystem. Our topic today is Azure Reservations, everything you need to know and might not know to ask. Directions analyst Wes Miller, who has written reports on this very topic, is my guest today. Hi, Wes. Thank you so much for doing the podcast with me today.
Hi, Mary Jo. Thank you for having me.
Wes, if you don't already know who he is, has been co-leading Directions on Microsoft's licensing boot camps for more than 12 years. In addition to teaching as part of the boot camps, Wes also analyzes and writes about Microsoft security, systems management, and identity technologies, including Entra ID and Intune. Okay, let's start at the very beginning because it's a very good place to start. Who or what workloads would typically benefit from Azure Reservations?
So the nice thing is, versus, when we first started out with these, I would have been able to say like 2 services or really 1 service, which was Azure VMs. Okay. But honestly, now, as you look across the range of services that Microsoft offers in Azure, I would say, we're at the point where easily like 40% of them have some form of reservation available now. Okay. And there's a big lengthy table that I've written for our report, and Microsoft does have some resources that walk through them. So it really comes down to which services you need and then figuring out, is there a reservation available for this? Okay. So for example, Azure SQL Database, Azure SQL as a whole, most of those services have reservations available. Not all, okay, but most of them. And that's where the devil gets in the details, is thinking about, okay, it's available for the service, but is it available the way I use the service? Because with Azure SQL in particular, there's some nuances in how you do deployments that could say, well, they're not available for us because we do this particular type of deployment. Those rules are generally pretty easy to find online. The nuance comes in understanding what services do and don't have it, and that's where you have to sort of step back and understand what you're building, and then is there a reservation available for it?
Okay. Is there anything you can recall that is like a surprising one that is not available under Azure Reservations, like any 1 or 2 big services that you're like, but not those?
No, for the longest time, I was always of the opinion that storage should be there. But what we've seen over the last several years is storage is there. So I think as Microsoft has been able to figure out ways to have models that work for reservations, you're pre-purchasing this ahead of time. They have some work to do within Microsoft, and then you have to buy them, obviously, as a customer. So I think it's taken a while to apply them across Azure in places where they're most useful. Mm-hmm. And I can't point out an exact gap, but there's always ones that pop up, and in particular when new services come up. So for example, Azure AI Services was a latecomer to having something called a reservation. But after it was released, it was so popular, they did introduce something called PTUs that kind of looked like a reservation if you squinted. Well, now it has a formal reservation model available too. So they're pretty much evolving as fast as we could document them. Okay.
Speaking of confusing terms, I saw in your recent report that you mentioned that under certain circumstances, there's also something called Azure Savings Plan that in some cases might actually give customers a better way to save than Azure Reservations. So I'm curious, can you talk about what are the differences and similarities between those two and when it might make sense for a customer to go with one versus the other?
Sure. I think it's actually pretty easy to break down. If you take a look at it the fundamentals that are the same are the duration. Typically, these are either you're acquiring them for a 1-year term or a 3-year term. You're agreeing to say, I'm going to purchase this much capacity and this is how much I'll use. And you're going to be paying for that whether you use it or not. It is a use it or lose it model in either case. The value, basically, the longer you agree to the term. So if you go for a 3-year term instead of a 1-year term on almost every one, both a reservation and the savings plan will give you a deeper savings. A reservation will almost always give you the deeper of the two, but I'm getting ahead of myself. And then the scope, which means if you purchase one of these, where can you assign it to? Because you wouldn't necessarily want it just assigned to your whole Azure tenancy, because one division of your organization might have been the one that committed the dollars for it. So you can assign it to an Azure tenancy, a management group, an Azure subscription, or a resource group, which a resource group is just as the name would imply, a group of resources, typically either an entire application or a model of an application.
Okay.
And then when we think about what's different, there's a whole bunch of differences between the two that make one more approachable than the other. In particular, reservations really require you to understand what you're building. And so I think of reservations as more the DevOps side has to guide what you're buying. And the savings plan, I thought, was really interesting when it came out because it gave some of the similar benefits. You're agreeing to the term, you're getting a discount. Sure, it's not as deep, but within a matter of months after you deploy in Azure for the first time, your procurement people, i.e. the people who are not sitting in DevOps and aren't intimately familiar with the applications, they can actually start building up a number, hold their finger up in the air. This is how much we spend on compute every month per hour, and this is how much we should buy. And so you could agree to a 1-year term. So the savings plan for compute, which is the only one that exists today, there could be others in the future, it's just so much more approachable for what's typically our more common customer, which is the procurement people, not the Azure implementers. An Azure implementer typically needs to be involved in the other side on the reservations because you've got to know which series, which size of virtual machine, like I said, what model of Azure SQL you're deploying and across which regions, et cetera, et cetera. It just can become incredibly complicated.
Okay. And because it is Microsoft, and they are incredibly complicated in many things. Savings plan is not even the only other term that customers might need to know when they're trying to figure this out, right? There's things called reserved VM instances, reserved capacity. Are these just other ways of talking about Azure reservations, or are there subtle or not so subtle differences?
There are some subtle or not so subtle differences, and one of them is reserved VM instances that when you're working with actual Azure VMs, you'll always see Azure VM instance or a RVMI, reserved VM instance. You'll see that as the term, and all it is the specific term that applies to it. But it has an interesting nuance to it, which is you don't have to buy exactly the right thing. You can get close. So it's almost like you need a BMW, so you agree to buy a 3 Series, but you wind up needing a 5 Series. It's sort of that thing, and it would pay for a tiny fraction of it. Well, that's what it does. If you bought the right series but not the right size, you'll have a fraction of it covered, which is still a savings.
Right.
So
sure.
that's just a nuance, and that is pretty unique to reserved VM instances. When we look across all the other services, there's just this litany of names. It's almost like everything else at Microsoft. When you're a product team and you're building this, you could name it whatever you want. And for example, we saw the Azure SQL team go wild with a couple of early things that they did. And they've come back in and are using reserved capacity much more often now. So reserved capacity is generally the term that's applied when you've got a collection of something like Azure SQL databases or a collection of storage. And then an RVMI is a particular instance or number of instances of a VM. So you'll just see a bunch of different terms that apply to a reservation. And I attempt to disambiguate all of these and assign them to the right service in the table that accompanies the report we've been talking about.
Okay, great. All right, on that note, let's take a break so that I can talk about a thing that's very near and dear to Wes's heart, the Directions on Microsoft Licensing Bootcamp. The next one that's happening in person is going to happen April 22nd to 24th in Atlanta. And these boot camps are more than 18 hours of training. It's the perfect time for you and your team to solve Microsoft licensing problems in real time with your peers and the Directions on Microsoft team. Your company is already spending millions of dollars on Microsoft licensing annually. Don't you ever wonder if you're overpaying? Do you have a good grasp of the complexities of Microsoft's constantly changing licensing rules and how you could potentially use them to cut costs? We at Directions have proven strategies and tactics that we can share. If you want to crush your Microsoft EA negotiation, come to the Atlanta Boot Camp. Or if you cannot attend in person, we also have upcoming licensing trainings that are virtual. There's even one next week, February 24th to 28th. In addition to boot camps, we also offer advisory services like EA negotiation support and Microsoft strategy assessments, where we can help you one-on-one with specific Microsoft product questions and licensing issues. If you want to find out more, go to directionsonmicrosoft.com or email us at info@directionsonmicrosoft.com, and you can learn about all the services that we offer. All right, back to Wes and more of his tips and tricks around Azure Reservations. So I want to talk about some limitations of Azure Reservations. I'm curious if there are gotchas that you can identify that customers might need to be wary of when they're considering whether or not to use Azure Reservations.
Sure thing. There's definitely some gotchas, and the biggest ones are, like I was saying, you want to sort of treat this as a gotcha as well, which is if you purchase a 1 year or a 3 year, remember you get a deeper discount if you go to 3. And there are a handful of things that even have a 5-year reservation duration, but it's really, there's 2 things, so we don't typically speak to them. The bigger thing is that you got a discount of like up to 72% or 46% for 3 or 1 year respectively. So it's a pretty big difference. So your gotcha there is buy carefully, because you're going to be overpaying if you go for 3 and you only needed 1 year. The biggest catches with reservations, though, are in its exchangeability and refundability. You can swap it. Microsoft's general rule, this is not something you'll see stated. It's more of a pirate's code.
Yeah.
But in general, with Microsoft, when you're dealing with products, if you want to swap a thing like for like, and you're buying something that costs more than the thing you're trying to exchange, they will often do it for you. So if you're staying in the same service and you just want to exchange it for a new service that's, another new year, they'll usually almost always do that for you, because it's in their benefit to have you continuing to use these. And we've seen some people use exchanges in creative ways when prices were going to increase or they needed to move to a new region, for example. Refundability, it's only refundable for 48 hours. So there's some fun catches.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's like, you better hurry up and decide, right?
Exactly. I always say never buy a reservation on a Friday, because you might not discover it until it's too late.
Yikes. Okay. Yeah, I was wondering about exchange and refunds, because I'm like, okay, what if you actually make a big boo-boo, right, when you're doing this, and you're like, I thought I was going to do that, but now I'm doing this. So it sounds like that's something you should be very careful about.
Exactly. And Microsoft even said in it was late 2023, that in 24 they were going to change the rules, and exchanges of reservations were going to basically go away. And as we've talked about a couple of times on podcasts and other webinars, and in our boot camps recently, Microsoft responds positively to negative feedback quite often, and they took that off the table. So for the foreseeable future, you'll be able to exchange these like for like, and the refundability and cancelability are there. Cancelability, of course, has that gotcha of you'll only claw back $50,000. So if you make a mistake, it's like ink. Try to correct it before it sets.
Thanks. Okay. All right. Anything else you think customers might want to know before jumping into the Azure Reservations pool?
No, I think the key thing is to know what your run rate, your low watermark of use of any particular service is. And you should be doing this already. Right. You probably aren't in many organizations because it takes work that you need to do. And Azure Cost Management, actually now Microsoft Cost Management, which Rob Sanfilippo has written some great reports about, uh, it dives into assessing and making some recommendations of, hey, you should downsize these VMs or you should upsize these VMs in order to optimize things. But the more you are attuned and attenuated to what services and what scale of services are being used across your organization, the more logical it becomes that you should start looking at reservations in pockets. And basically, I'd love to see, I haven't seen this yet, but I'd love to see a company where they've got reservations that are applied really broadly across it, and there's only exceptions where reservations aren't applied. But today, that tends to be the exception. I also think it's important for companies to look at savings plan, because you could, like I said, you can get in the door with Azure and within a matter of 3 months have a savings plan that covers your Azure compute, and that's anything that has compute running underneath it. There's no refunds and no cancelability at all with a savings plan. But the good thing about savings plan is a lot of customers have overpaid for their Azure, and this is a good way to spend that, because you'll apply it to this, you'll save money, and you'll be actually taking your dollar further.
Okay, great. Well, thank you as always, Wes. Really good insights and information.
Thank you very much for having me, as always.
To close, I'd like to remind our listeners they can find lots more coverage of all things Microsoft related at directionsonmicrosoft.com. In addition to the extensive reports and licensing reference materials that we create for our clients, we also have a blog, as well as the archives of all of our podcasts available on our site for members and non-members alike. So if you're not a member yet, you can still check out our blogs and podcasts. Thank you so much for listening. If you have questions, comments, or any topics that you would like to hear the Directions analysts cover in one of these podcasts, please do not hesitate to contact me at X at Mary Jo Foley. And speaking of X, give us a follow at Directions MSFT or on Blue Sky at directionsonmicrosoft.com for all of the latest Microsoft Enterprise product and licensing information. Thank you very much.